I'm Liam Billingham.
I'm George Fragopoulos.
I'm Alissa Wilkinson.
Whoa! And this is
Oeuvre Busters.
Yes! Deep dives by dialectical dudes. The tagline that I keep trying to make happen, whether it happens or not,
it's gonna
we'll
happen.
Have to see.
Well, I have these boxes filled with T-shirts with that slogan, so I've been trying to move them for the last 2 weeks.
But the problem is the DD looks like the Dunkin' Donuts logo, so we're gonna be like in a terrible copyright trademark war with them.
I owe some suspicious looking dudes at the T-shirt factory thousands of dollars, and if I don't start paying them back, they are.
I like that it's your cousins in Astoria that are making these T-shirts.
Some shady Greek guys, are like, it's like, hey, where's the money? I don't care that you're family. I gave you 5,000 T-shirts. I expect a return on my investment. Like, God damn it. Come on, Stavros. Come on.
We'll sell them on Patreon. Remember when we started the show and we just get goofed for a minute and Alyssa was just sitting there? Hi, Alyssa. Thanks.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us for the podcast. This is really great.
I'm glad I could.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun, and it's quite a movie to talk about. Do you mind if I read your bio quickly so everyone knows?
Sure.
Cool. Alissa Wilkinson is Vox.com's film critic and associate professor of English and Humanities at the King's College in New York City. She's also a member of the New York Film Critics Circle and the National Society of Film Critics. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Of course, we're really happy to have you. And it's good to have another... George, you keep getting academics this season.
I know.
You keep having fellow academics.
You're outnumbered once again, Liam. 2-1.
I am. I am.
Well, at least I'm not a Kurosawa scholar, so you can just pretend I am a dilettante in this.
I'm a dilettante in everything I do as well.
Yeah, you really are. It's terrible.
It's embarrassing.
I try to be one. Speaking of Kurosawa, George, what movie are we talking about today?
We are discussing 1950s Rashomon. I don't know if people have heard of this film before, but it's a small little
a little known independent film from Japan.
Known independent, one of the greatest films ever made. So Rashomon tells the story, or it begins with 3 men, a woodcutter, a priest, and a listener or a cynic, waiting out a storm. And I guess we should also talk about kind of the archetypal or allegorical kind of figures of these 3 anonymous people. And basically the woodcutter and the priest begin to recount their involvement regarding the murder of a samurai and the rape of the samurai's wife by a bandit by the name of Tajomaru. The film then begins to give us the perspective of all 4 of the people involved directly in the crime and its aftermath. And obviously what we find out is that everybody has a very, very varying and different take on what in fact happened in the forest regarding the murder and the rape of the samurai's wife. Eventually the film ends with, of course, no real objective truth or understanding of whose story is the right story or the one closest to the truth. The 3 men then hear the crying of a baby. The listener then steals something from the crying child, an amulet that is supposedly protecting it, or the kimono, actually, right? Yeah, he steals the kimono, from the baby. The woodcutter then intervenes and basically tells the priest that he will take care of the baby because he already has 6 children. And this kind of final act of generosity or humanity reinstills faith into, gives the priest kind of a renewed sense of faith that he has been lacking for the entirety of the film. And the storm ends, and so does the film. Yeah. The end.
Very, very the end.
The end. Indeed.
It was directed and edited by Akira Kurosawa, produced by Minoru Jingo. The screenplay was by Akira Kurosawa and Shinobu Hashimoto. It's based on 2 short stories, one called In a Grove, and the other, mostly the title is pulled from, Rashomon by Ryonosuke Akutagawa. The music is by Fumio Hayazaka, who did a lot of music for Kurosawa films, and the cinematography, which is among, I think, the most influential pieces of, cinematography of all time, and it's amazing to look back and watch it, is by Kazu Miyagawa. The cast includes the Kurosawa mainstays Takashi Shimura as Kikori, the woodcutter, Minoru Chiaki as Tabhoshi, the priest, Kichiro Ueda as the listener, or also described as a common person. Toshiro Mifune as Tajumaru, the bandit. Machiko Kyo as the samurai's wife. Masayuki Mori as the samurai, who's the husband of the wife. I wish there was a better descriptor. And Noriko Honma as Miko, the medium. It was a really low-budget movie, but most of the money was set on the massive gate, that Rashomon gate that existed between Kyoto and Nara. Sorry. It gets credit, the film, for being the first to point the camera right at the sun. And there's actually an interesting interview with Robert Altman where he saw this movie and then the next day pointed the camera at the sun because he was so like blown away by it. Whether that's true or not, it's the film that gets credit for it.
I mean, whether it's true or not seems less important when you're talking about the movie Rashomon.
yeah, exactly. It's just so like, it's funny because you read all these things and people are like, well, it's not true, but you're like, does it matter? It doesn't really
proves
matter.
The point. Yes,
exactly. Kurosawa was reaching back to silent cinema to make this movie, and Rashomon was like, he described it as kind of research or an experiment, which is a incredible way to describe like a perfectly created work of art that's like as research. It's really fascinating. Daiei, the company that financed it, was reluctant to do so, but then in a very Rashomon-esque thing, the producer or the exec at Daiei then said like, oh, I knew the film was going to be a hit. I knew it was going to be great, despite being like very reluctant. The ending was so shocking to people that they wanted to know what actually happened in the woods, which is so incredible to think about. And I feel like, interestingly, it feels like things have swung back that way culturally. So it'd be an interesting thing to talk about. It won the Grand Prix at Venice, beating, I can't believe this list, Renoir's The River, Bresson's Diary of a Country Priest, Elia Kazan's A Streetcar Named Desire, and Billy Wilder's Ace in the Hole. Can you imagine
that is quite a lineup.
It's incredible. So yes, this is an important film. This isn't in the notes, but I think one of my favorite Simpsons jokes of all time is Marge telling Homer, you liked Rashomon? His response is, that's not how I remember it. Anytime we can talk about The Simpsons, we should. Alissa, what did you think of the film? I think you said you saw it recently for the first time.
Yeah, I realized at some point that while I knew a lot about this movie, like I knew who made it and I knew why it was significant and I knew the plot, I like had not actually seen the movie. And wow. So back in, I think January maybe, it played as part of some program at Metrograph, the theater in New York, and I had a habit, if I had a free evening, of stopping by and seeing whatever movie was playing before I went home if I hadn't seen it already. So I saw it there. It was both very much the same and quite different from what I had perceived it to be. Like, I knew what it looked like. I knew who was in it. I kind of knew all that kind of stuff. But I hadn't realized how... I don't really know what the right word is, but I guess I hadn't realized how much time like passes in the movie and how significant that is, I think, for the different recountings of the story. And I don't think I knew about the framing device and this idea about someone's faith in humanity being shaken and being restored. That kind of struck me. And then I rewatched it yesterday for this podcast and was struck again by those things. Also kind of watched some of the features and realized things that I hadn't really thought about. How did they pull off certain shots? That's not maybe something that I am always thinking about because I don't I don't know that much about cinematography. I just know that I look at it. So yeah, I mean, it's phenomenal. It's great. It's definitely a movie that you have to kind of psych yourself up for. Like, I think I got over and I thought, that was 90 minutes. It definitely felt longer than 90 minutes, but I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think what that says is the movie makes you kind of experience time differently than you do in your normal life. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean it's really I definitely coming back to that idea of like experiencing time. This is really distinct. George, in your notes you wrote lukewarm, which I really hope is a joke.
I was just kind of like, this film's so.
I don't know about this one.
Yeah, I didn't buy into the forest backdrop for some strange reason. No, this is I think only the second time I've seen this, and I remember the first time I watched it. I remember really enjoying it, and I was eager to sit down and watch it again. And yeah, I was just completely riveted from the very, very beginning, and I was just just totally taken by it. This film is amazing. It's also one of those films for me where the hype definitely lives up to the experience of watching it. And I think what really struck me this time around was, well, I guess a couple of things. And I didn't really think about this until like rather late, but I was like, what are we supposed to also make of the fact that we're getting all of these stories, maybe perhaps directly through the woodcutter himself as well? So that there's another kind of layer of, let's say, mistrust or perhaps misunderstanding that we need to kind of like wade through and make sense of. But beyond that too, one thing that really stood out to me this time was kind of the confrontation with the camera, right? I totally forgot that so much of like what this film is the actors speaking directly to the camera, and you don't hear these interlocutors, you don't hear these judges or these prosecutors, whoever they are, interviewing them. And I thought the confrontational aspect of that was really fascinating. And I do remember hating the the ending a little bit when the first time I saw it, and I still think it's probably the weakest part of the film. And from my understanding, Kurosawa was forced to make that ending, right, to include the baby.
Really?
That's what I remember reading somewhere. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I didn't catch that in the stuff I was reading.
That the film was so bleak that the producers basically said, like,
"Oh, you're right. There was a push. You're right. I do remember reading that now."
Yeah, that you need to give us something, give the audience something. And he was like, "What about a baby?" And the producer's like, "Everybody loves a baby. Run with it."
Deus Ex baby. Yeah, for sure.
But I just love this film.
It's interesting. I didn't think of it until this exact moment, but in the reading that I was doing, the idea that Kurosawa was reaching back to like French silent cinema is really interesting in terms of making it. And though it's not French, I thought a little bit when you mentioned the sort of like confrontational nature of the interrogation of the Passion of Joan of Arc.
Yeah, with
that
the
film
close-ups,
where there's, it's based on, which I haven't seen in a long time, but I remember being completely blown away by, even despite watching it on like a 12-inch TV in my dorm room in college. But the fact that it's so, the text of that film is just taken from the trial, and it's mostly close-ups of Renee Falconetti and the judges. It just made me think of it. I love this movie a lot. I saw it for the first time, in like my second year in New York City. So that would have been like 12, 13 years ago. And I remember being like very disturbed by it, which I thought was pretty amazing because it's from 1950. Like I remember getting, particularly the sequence with the medium. I found that like very, very troubling. Yeah. And then it was one of those films where this is the kind of time I had then. It ended, and I think I watched it again. Like, I think it ended, and I just said, I'm going to watch this again. Rewatching it this week, I found it still pretty disturbing. And I was really, really struck, Alissa, sort of as you brought up, by the framing device. The framing device did not stick in my head when I saw it initially. It just wasn't something I thought of. So when it started with the Rashomon gate, I was like, oh, and these guys at the gate, I was like, oh yeah, this is in the movie, which is kind of crazy because the title comes from the Rashomon gate. And I just like, the framing device, it's almost like, as you said, George, it adds to the complexity of the subjectivity of this movie. And I think it's something we should talk into, which is like, to me, there's obviously no reliable narrator, but there's not even a reliability in what we get from the characters. And so, yeah, I was blown away by it. And I find it like incredibly challenging, 70 years later. It came out 70 years ago, like this week or something like that, which is crazy timing. But yeah, it's amazing. I feel like that's like what I have to say. Cool. Podcast over. Let's move on. how do you feel about that framing device? Does it work for you?
One thing I love about it is that is the rain, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, but like the fact that that is kind of a significant part of the framing device, that it's just like pouring down rain outside and they're stuck in this hut and they've got to like discover the meaning of life kind of accidentally or the meaning of humanity through these stories. So that works. And I do feel like if I didn't have it, I might not know why I had just watched this. I don't know. I don't know how much I love what happens at the end. But that doesn't really matter. I think that the framing device gives me a sense for like why it matters, why it would matter to tell this kind of a story, and why it would matter to tell it in a visual medium. That there's kind of like an essential human need to, like kind of a basic need to be able to trust other people a little bit. And also alongside that is the need to find a way to maintain maybe your faith in humanity, even knowing that actually this is how things are, right? Like any story you get is always through someone's perspective, even if they're trying very hard to be perfectly truthful. We don't have the cinema eye view on reality. Like nobody's recording reality the way that we, that we might sort of look at reality on a movie screen. So that works for me from that perspective, just kind of adding like a humanistic element to all of that. Because otherwise it's real bleak.
It's so bleak.
It's very
and
bleak,
it also like, it begs an interesting question, like, which makes me, one of the things that's interesting is like this film, like we sort of alluded to, it sort of teaches you how to watch it.
Yes.
And it made me think, I feel like I make this comparison too much on the show, but it makes me think a lot about Genteel, Chantal Akerman's movie, which you spend like the first 25 minutes at minimum being like, sort of staring at the screen like, what?
Why am
I watching this woman bake bread? But then suddenly something shifts. And it sort of makes me think about the role of the director in a film like this, because what else? You need a framing device. Like what else? How else do you attempt to tell the story in this movie?
Well, at some point, it's funny you should say that too, because at some point I was like, oh, what this film is about the experience of taking in any work of art, or like cinema in particular, obviously for us, so that the kind of fragmentary nature is basically the fragmentary kind of experience that we all have when we take in a work of art. We will all experience it in a different kind of way. Obviously, that's not the only thing this film is about, but it came to
that's it.
But it came to me thinking about the kind of confrontational nature again of the actors in front of the camera, and thinking about them obviously looking at us as an audience and then asking us to kind of consider what it is that we're watching in that kind of very engaged and active way, which Jean Delman also does too, but like obviously in a completely different way.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the things, and we've talked about this is sort of becoming an ongoing thread in this season, and we talked about it in our Quiet Duel episode, is that it feels sometimes like I hesitate to say this like in a negative way, but sometimes it feels like not necessarily a ton of things are happening, but Akira Kurosawa is maybe one of the great filmmakers, and this is one of the great movies about people looking at things. There's so much material, so many sequences and so many camera moves that swing around to show someone watching what's happening. And I feel on some, and of course then there's the moments when the people giving testimony are like looking sort of at the audience. Like I feel like this is a movie that works in that you're watching and they're watching you, and it just sort of blows me away in that regard. In terms of how we look about things and feeling implicated in the experience of watching the movie.
For sure.
Yeah. I think there's also a sense in which, and I would have to go back and study it pretty closely, although I'm sure someone else has already, but sometimes we're in someone's imagination and sometimes we're watching. And it feels like it has something to do with how it's edited, in that the last sequence when there's a fight. That fight goes on forever. forever and ever, and it never really, there's no like time jumping. It's just, and it's like, oh yeah, he's in the bush watching this happen. Of course, we're still getting it filtered through his storytelling, but it feels a little different from the earlier tellings of it, in which things feel a little more fluid, or you know, like people don't keep falling down like they do when he tells. It's like
pratfalls.
They're totally incompetent fighters. Yeah, which is amazing.
Yes. And they're like running away from each other, and they're scared, and they're very sweaty. And that to me is really interesting, as well as sort of part of the whole here, and of part of the idea of looking and how we look with our mind's eyes and our actual eyes. And
I guess that one thing that doesn't necessarily, and I think the thing when we think about this movie, like you said before, like I feel like I knew what this movie was before I saw it. Like, you know, it's so ingrained culturally. We've seen so many different, you know, incarnations of this, but the thing that makes it amazing is that it is really fluid in terms of whose experience we're having, and like sometimes we're hearing voiceover, sometimes we're seeing things happen, and I feel as though that's so sort of surprising, and you're not able to kind of like I can see why when people saw this in 1950, they were like, but what actually happened? And one of the things that I think is quietly provocative about the woodcutter's take on the story, and like maybe this is not exactly what's intended, but the thing that I took away the fourth time with took away with the fourth story, the woodcutter's perspective, is we never see the woodcutter. In any other movie, there would be a reaction shot of him like ducking down when the bandit turns to face him or something like that. But that almost makes the last part of this movie feel even more complicated, because we're, like George said, we're filtering the experience of everybody through the woodcutter. But then when the woodcutter tells the story, he's not a participant in his own story. Which makes you wonder like what he views his role in the narrative as. Because he's kind of the audience surrogate.
For sure, yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Lots to think about.
Alyssa and George paused and thought about it for a moment.
I also thought about that with the medium, right? Because once again, like, okay, so this guy, like, even if we take that on its own terms, that a guy is going to talk through a medium from beyond the grave, like, it's still mediated. Literally what a medium does is mediate a story. And so there's kind of an extra layer of every story is coming at us, not just through one telling, but through one telling filtered through another telling, and then also filtered through this cinematic medium. So it's just like a very... I teach postmodern theory, and so a lot of times we talk about like how the stories we tell are perspectival, and how they're mediated through language, and they're mediated through experience, and they morph and they change, and that doesn't mean they're lying necessarily, although somebody probably is in this version of this kind of a story, but like becoming aware of the levels of mediation between us and stories, I think, can be really good for us, or like make us humble or something like that.
Yeah,
totally. Do you think that on some level we're intended? I mean, okay. It's so funny because I feel like I'm asking questions about this movie, but I'm like, oh, of course, this is what the movie's trying to do. But I feel like we're intended to be suspicious of everything we see, and I don't see that in movies at all anymore. Right. I mean, maybe some nonfiction style stuff, but certainly not in fiction.
It's funny because one of the films that I thought about, because I'm always thinking about this film, but I was like, oh, Liam would like this comparison, is thinking about like how this film influenced something like Zodiac. And
George, stop.
I hit Liam's G-spot. Like, yes, please say Zodiac again.
More Zodiac talk, please.
But
existential detective dramas. Thank you.
But going back to kind of what Alyssa was saying regarding the kind of, let's say, maybe not the postmodern approach to it, but thinking about also the film's form and how indebted it is, or how it's different. At certain moments, it feels like it's a horror film. Like, again, with the rain, with the medium. At other times, it's a crime procedural. At other times, it's a samurai film. it blends all of these genres in a very interesting and obviously thoughtful and well done way. And I think the form of it is also meant to replicate the kind of sense of not knowing what is true or what is real and what is not real. And I think, like, on the level of form, the film also replicates that in a really, really brilliant way.
Yeah, and this is like an ongoing thing with the history of cinema and criticism, and also just like the way people were trained to watch movies. So I also watched this Altman interview, which it runs with it on the Criterion channel right now, so you can watch it there. And he's like, people just think when they see stuff on screen that that's what happened. And what I love about it is that it just challenges that instantly, like actually challenges the act of viewing, which is so great. I love it when a movie does that. And Foreman, you're right, like cinematic nonfiction can do it, but if you do that in a big movie that a lot of people will see, they really do not appreciate it very much. Right. I just watched Funny Games for the first time. I've literally been too scared to watch it, but I finally watched it.
Another movie I love.
And was reminded that this is something Michael Haneke loves to explore as well. The first Haneke movie I saw was Caché, like in the theater.
Me too, actually.
Didn't know what I was going into. And it's so much about that, like, watching and being watched, but also like the way that film itself, or like screens, cinema, I don't know, whatever we're going to call this whole moving image medium, like has trained us to believe at the things that we look at. And we are going to have to unlearn that as a species. Whenever we kind of talk about this same thing with my students in my class, for years have been telling them, deep fakes are coming, and I explain what a deep fake is, where you see something, you saw it with your own eyes, but it's not real. And now they're actually going to know what I'm talking about. But for years, they've just kind of looked at me with this like horror on their face, right? But, yeah.
Well, it's interesting with Caché because I thought a little bit about, there's that theory, I don't know if anyone's ever really written about this in a lot of detail, but the theory that the person that gives Georges the tape in Caché is actually Haneke himself. And so that he's the one filming their house, which, like, I don't think that's... Again, this is one of those interesting things where I'm like, well, it can't be that, but it's like, it could be that. Who knows what it is?
Does the tape just arrive in the mail?
Yeah. Hey, this isn't a Caché podcast, George.
Sorry, it's just been a while.
But the idea that, like, maybe the person, it's like both true and not true at the same time, that the person telling this story is Akira Kurosawa. So, like, ultimately on some level we're getting Akira Kurosawa's version of things. But is there like a thumbprint? Is there like an obvious moment where there's like a direct nod to that? No, I don't think so. The one thing that I do think is interesting to think about with that, and this comes back to the idea of weather, is the use of the sun in this movie. Because you mentioned that the film is something of a horror movie, which I think it is, but one thing I think it does really interestingly is that sometimes the most disturbing moments are the brightest. As opposed to the tendency in horror films to be like, let's shroud everything in darkness and people won't know what's going around the corner. It's like there's a moment in the film where the light hits the wife and her behavior shifts. And it feels very distinct. I believe it's in her version of the story. It's actually, maybe it's in the medium's version of the story. And suddenly everything feels different. And that juxtaposed against the idea of like the apocalyptic weather. The water that's literally dyed with ink so that it appears on the camera to look darker in the Rashomon gate sequence. Like, I sometimes like feel like when you talk about a directorial hand, and this is sort of like coming back to what we in some ways just directing in general, but I feel Akira Kurosawa in the way he uses the weather and the lighting in this movie.
Yeah, the natural elements for sure.
Yeah, and them not being used in the most obvious ways.
Yeah, I really thought, watching it again, I really thought the interplay of like the light and the shadows and the forest were meant to be, again, this kind of formal or this aesthetic nod to, again, the confusion in the film, right? Like a light and dark, truth versus lies, that kind of thing. It's like, oh yeah, like this is amazing. Like the way he's using it in the forest is again meant to replicate our kind of uncertainty about what's unfolding.
They also said, I heard in some interviews that it was just very dark in the forest to begin with. It's like a very leafy forest, and so they had to use mirrors to reflect light onto the actors, which they stole from costume, which is a great use of your costume department.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
But it does. I mean, the light does have that kind of odd reflective quality to it in some places, especially. It's just very, like you're saying, it's very bright and also very dark, and it made me think of kind of like a Rembrandt self-portrait, where it's like, you know, the man we present to the world and the man we actually are to ourselves. I don't know that. I think this was really incidental to needing mirrors to reflect light in a very dark forest, but yeah, it's very much in that realm, and it means that all of these images are obviously beautifully composed, but they all have much more going on in them, I think, than you would think for a movie with so few characters in them. And often there's only one character in frame. And yet there's like stuff in the background, or, you know, in those interrogation scenes when they're talking to us, there's always like two guys sitting in the back corner also listening, so that we're not just having an encounter, we're also being listened to during this interrogation.
I think one of the things that stood out to me this time, in addition to that, sort of the stuff that's like cultural baggage, and I don't think or this cultural baggage meaning stuff that we've seen and that's inherited from this movie and passed on to so many others, is the one thing that really struck me this time was the role of the wife in this movie. To like use contemporary sort of thinking about it, there's some real moments where it feels like there's like slut shaming, and other moments where she's sort of portrayed as this woman that wants to have sex with anyone that'll have her, and she's like deprived. But then at the end, in the final woodcutter story, it's almost like she's the one with power ultimately, but then that shifts. I just found it very like disturbingly culturally relevant, and also more challenging than I remember. From like most people do, I feel like Mifune from this movie, the wife didn't stand out to me when I saw it 12 years ago. This time I was sort of blown away by the role of the wife in this movie. It stood out to me more than anything else.
Yeah, I was struck by as well by her in this one. I think because the first time through I was trying so hard to get a handle on what she was doing, forgetting that, you know, these are essentially different versions of a person, but her, it's almost like she's become, in the last recounting, the kind of maniacal character that we've been told the bandit is throughout. And they do kind of seem to trade places with one another a little bit, depending on who's telling the story. And I don't know the history of like the storytelling tradition that this movie falls into, outside of the cinema sort of reflective of French or European cinema. But I don't know it as well, but I think that those characters that belong to these different sorts, you know, we've got like the evil one and the foolish one and the like weak one or whatever, seeing them rotate around and seeing her become those different characters is so striking, you know, for various reasons. But yeah, when she's laughing in the last sequence, it's very reminiscent of how, you know, the bandit is laughing when he's being questioned earlier in the film. Just totally unhinged.
Yeah, and there's almost this weird quality of like, she seems as though, well, I mean, I think that this is apparent, but this is a film of men, and like so many of Kurosawa's movies are about men, and she feels as though she's treated differently in that sequence where she's telling her story, and sometimes it's like she's hysterical in a way that they're not hysterical. But then the fact that in Tojimaru's version of the story, it's like a sword fight. And it's really, and they're good fighters, and he like compliments the samurai's fighting style. And then in the woodcutter's version, they're like two little boys. It's like if George and I got into a fight, just like two people slapping each other. Feels like it feels pointed. Like, to me, this feels like there's a little bit of cultural critique of masculinity by Kurosawa in this movie.
Yep.
Well, that last sequence too is the one where they're all presented as being really shitty, obviously. Whereas in obviously when they're telling their side of the story, they are kind of valorizing, or they're putting themselves in the role of the hero. But in the woodcutter's version, they're all terrible.
Yeah. Although the woman seems to be like, at least she kind of knows what she wants, and she's gonna get it, which is the sort of the anti-hero version of her, I guess, or something. Whereas the men are just, I mean, there's so much tripping. There's so much tripping and falling.
They're like sketchbook, it's like Chaplin-esque.
Yeah, why can't you run? What's wrong with you? She has no trouble with it. She's not the one falling all over the place. They are. But yeah, I mean, I feel like she's this kind of like figure of chaos in every version of the story, including her own, where... You know, like she like men in a world of men, like you have a bandit and you have a samurai and they're in the forest and like they kind of know what to do. And she's like this element of whatever, whether it's like passion or fear or like shame or this sort of like maniacal anger over like the lot that she's been dealt in life. That feels, I think, why she's so sparkling and memorable, and there's only one other woman in the whole story, and she's just a voice. You know, she's just a conduit for a man. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting also because, you know, whenever you read about Kurosawa, there's always a point made that like there was only one female lead in a Kurosawa movie, and it's Setsukahara in No Regrets for Our Youth, which is also kind of a movie, which is a movie ultimately about a woman sort of like coming into her own and figuring out how to live. And like, it's interesting, although the wife is not the lead in this film, she takes a really prominent role, and in some ways is the most, I think, dynamically different character in each version of the story.
Well, it's also her rape is also the only crime that we're sure that exists in all four versions, because even in the samurai's own version, right, it's not a murder, it's a suicide. So it's also interesting to think, again, like thinking about how it is that her story and the crime against her is in many respects like the central action, right, or the thing that binds all of these stories together. Like the one thing they agree on is that she was the victim of this crime.
And yet, I'm not totally convinced that's what what they're talking about in the sort of framing story when they say, you know, this is this is worse than all the wars and all of the pestilence and whatever. This is the thing that has shaken my faith in man. And I don't know that it's ever clear whether the fact that they can't decide what the real story is what's so shaken them, or whether it's because there's so many levels of distrust, or what exactly that is.
It's also interesting in that context. Again, it's like I totally forgot about this framing device that it's Takashi Shimura, who, you know, is in like every Kurosawa movie and is probably like 22 when they made this movie, but looks 65. And next to this this commoner figure who's sort of like the cynical figure of the film and doesn't like, whenever he hears the story, is so like, yeah, of course, like, yeah, people are terrible. And then this priest who actually seems like he's 22 or 23 years old. And it's just interesting to come back to the idea that like the conduit through which we're hearing the story is through the woodcutter. And so it this time I felt like, again, everything felt more complicated. Like the wife has a line at one point in the story when she says, "To have my shame known to two men is worse than dying." And it's so dramatic, but like part of me in 2020 is watching that and I'm just like rolling my eyes, because it's just like, well, clearly a dude is telling this story.
Yes. Yes, and later someone's like, you've you've slept with 2 men. Why don't you kill yourself?
Oh yeah, the husband, right? Yeah, I think the husband.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
We've been accused of having like two like contemporary read on these movies, but it's impossible not to like hear that and be like, come on. But then you feel like maybe he's commenting on it as much as he's presenting it. I mean, the whole movie is kind of commenting on itself on some level.
Yeah, and go back to what Alissa said. It's interesting if you think about the fact that the only other woman in the film is the medium whose body is possessed by a man. So the possession of like women's bodies in this film is a very interesting, you know, like subplot or through line to all 4 of these stories.
My favorite moment in the movie is when she's like, you guys should kill each other. Like, I just found that like unusually, like I was like, yeah, do it. You guys suck.
And we're so sick of those guys, I feel like, at that point.
100%.
That it's like, yes, please, for the love of God.
I'm really sick of the husband. And when like, because I forget in whose narrative it is, but at some point she's basically like, listen, you have to save me from this boring fucking samurai. This guy's lame. He sucks.
Yeah, this guy's
He's so
lame.
Square. Like, please do something to save me
I'm
from
so bored. Get me out of here.
like,
that might be... Is that her version of it? I can't remember at this point, but
I think it's his version.
It might be. It might be. Yeah, it sounds like it's his version of the thing. Speaking of him, I don't think I appreciated, maybe because we're watching these films in order, that this is the first time, for lack of a, to be simple about it, where we see Mifune really Mifune it up. Because so many of the performances before this, he's very withdrawn and reserved. And just like, I love the idea that like on day 1 of shooting, he like did a take and Kurosawa was like, Toshiro, come here. And he was like, come on, like, just let it out. Like, do the thing that we've wanted you to do. Because he's like, he told him to play like a lion. And it's just such a extreme, sometimes hard to watch. And I don't mean that negatively. I mean, like, he's so intense that at times you're like, it's really off-putting to watch, which I think was a response that the movie got when it came out. People were like, what is this acting? Who is this Mifune guy? It's just such a extreme performance. And I don't think we've seen it. I mean, going chronologically, it's so clear that this is like what they decided on going forward in a lot of the more like iconic roles. And he's so inflated, and I think that's interesting. He has such an inflated sense of self, like his version of the story being like, yeah, I'm a pretty good swordsman. I forgot about that expensive sword. No big deal.
And yet he's such a like, I was noticing how much even his affect changes in the last version. He's like such a sad sack in the last version. Not just because he keeps tripping over his own feet, but like his face changes. And he looks terrified.
He's scared,
yeah. It does feel like something out of silent film where you would have been telegraphing or broadcasting like what's going on in your head without having a way to say it.
I think it's interesting that what at least I remember about the movie is the sort of exuberant, maniacal Mifune, and not that like pathetic, sad kind of like different take where he's begging her to marry him. Like, it's interesting how the thing we remember is the sort of like the most bravado and the most kind of like, hey, what's up kind of, or whatever version of that is. The most like traditionally masculine version of it is the one that sticks out and has been like celebrated culturally, not the kind of like beta-ish nervous character that he is in the second half, if that's the right way to describe it. I want to chat briefly about the that there's a great line in the movie which is said by the most cynical characters, the commoner, which he says is, I don't care if it's a lie as long as it's entertaining.
Right.
Which, not to make this like a political conversation necessarily, but one of the things that's been sitting in my brain since I watched the film last week is like how we're living in this like world right now where everyone is seeing some of the same images and they're having completely different interpretations of what they're seeing. And I couldn't help but like, I know this is simple but like that line resonating with me like the week of the Republican National Convention and the idea of like, well, who cares if it's true? Like, we have a showman telling us a story. And it grosses me out that that's what I thought about, but it makes the film feel really politically resonant in this moment.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure there's been a time when people haven't felt like that was going on. Not to say it's not escalated, but I've been reading a lot of political history from the 60s, and it's pretty wild how much the stuff that people say is very much an echo of what we say today, even though it's for different circumstances. And I think, you know, this movie is set not contemporaneously to the, you know, the actual time that it came out in, obviously. So it's like an old story. And so that, in addition, I think makes it feel kind of timeless. And I think that's also maybe something that's really great about the framing device as well, is that it feels like you can imagine the legend where it's like three strangers happened upon one another one rainy night. Like, that just sounds like something that...
Like a fairy tale.
Yeah.
Like a fairy tale, yeah. And it's... Or like a myth or something.
Parable,
and so... Yeah, exactly. And I think... I can easily imagine that way, a folktale. And... that a story like that would continue to have so much resonance for today, I think is a feature, not a bug. Like, I don't think we're supposed to just leave it in the past. I think we're supposed to carry it with us into the present and the future. And that seems like doing a film like this a service, instead of sort of fixing it, you know, like a mosquito in amber or something like that.
Or like a museum piece that we only watch at yeah, for sure. Well, it's also interesting when you think about the framing device, and this is something I thought about, is it made me think a little bit about the framing device in I almost said 10 Things I Hate About You, but in The Taming of the Shrew, my God.
Oh, well, I mean...
Of course. That kind of framing device that immediately gets excised anytime you see the play, like the drunken guy being told the story as he sobers up is really interesting. But it also has like almost a Brechtian quality where it's like three people meet and they tell each other. So it's very theatrical, and it's very like theatrical theater commenting on itself. Theatrical. I'm sitting in front of a fire and I'm going to tell you a story.
Yeah. Very Turn of the Screw, if anybody's...
Oh.
Yeah. But it's funny because I also read that line as a commentary again on film itself, so that there's obviously a certain sense of verisimilitude to any sort of film, because it's just put down the camera, catch what happens in front of it. Obviously it's planned, it might not be planned, whatever, but there's an automatic sense of it being real. And I just thought it was like, oh, like Kurosawa here is also commenting on the experience of, again, watching the film. I know it's a lie, but as long as it's entertaining, I could care less.
Yeah.
There's a lot. 45 minutes in, guys.
This film might be deep. This film might be
This might be a complicated film.
We haven't even touched on the spirituality of it, the humanistic kind of take on it. The fact that in the original version, by the way, the priest and the woodcutter are like, oh, is there like a name tag on the baby? And the one guy goes, oh yeah, it says here it's baby Hitler. Dun, dun, dun.
I was like, wait, there's a name tag on the baby?
And then Rashomon 2, which never got made, but they have to decide whether or not they would actually kill baby Hitler. So that's
Rashomoner. Rashomoner. That's the name of it. Rashomon 2, Rashomon.
I've just been watching all of the Bill and Ted movies for obvious reasons. So, yeah.
I can't wait.
I am very excited about.
So have you seen the third one? So you haven't seen?
I have seen the third one. It is delightful. I honestly wasn't expecting much because of because of those stupid things critics do, where they're only giving us the screener 2 days before it comes out. It must be a terrible movie, but actually it's great.
Good.
Totally see it. It'd be a really good drive-in movie if you have access to that.
It's gonna feel like a warm hug. Yes,
it will. It very much will.
You know, I did not anticipate us talking about Bill and Ted 3 when talking about Rashomon, but I'm going to tell you guys I'm into it. I think that's really great. You know, one thing we've talked about at the end of, as we wrap up the episode, is we'll do a thing where we'll be like, but who is the titular stray dog? And obviously we can't really do, it's like, who is the titular Rashomon doesn't really make sense. But one thing that I'm sort of curious about is like, do you guys feel like this movie has a central or like a main character? And I feel like someone who like you view as being who the movie is ultimately about. And I feel like that could lead into maybe a brief conversation about the ending, because I have mixed feelings on the ending of the movie as well.
I mean, in a way, I feel like the movie is about the priest, who sort of doesn't really participate in this except to just like be sent into this like state of existential despair and then have sort of his mind changed by this thing that happens. But I don't know if it counts as main character, but he certainly is the one who goes through actual development as a character in the course of the movie that isn't flashbacks. No, I would say he's the only one. And also we're assuming, I mean, and again, immediately we make the assumption that the framing device itself were meant to take as actually happening, quote unquote. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I found myself thinking about him because of that. And because he's in such a state of like, he's just so despairing when we first meet him. He's like, you know, this thing has conquered even a wise priest. And then by the end, he's changed his mind. Although the last person we see is like, you know, the woodcutter trudging away with the baby. So maybe that's significant too.
The woodcutter feels on some level like potentially who the movie is about, but I think you're right in that he doesn't change in the course of the film. Like, he doesn't go through a kind of evolution. Like, to my mind, he's just as likely at the beginning of the film to take the baby under his wing as he is at the end of the film. And I struggle with that ending. I actually don't know if I dislike it. I like the hope. I think I'm into the hope. I think it's like a real necessary thing, especially because you're just sitting there for 85 minutes. Like, my God. But also, I hate to say this about what I think is a really, really amazing movie, is that it sometimes feels as though the ending might be slightly unearned. Mm-hmm. Like, why do we get... I mean, no one's going to kill a baby unless they're like Lars von Trier, but it just feels hard to... just literally kills a baby in a movie. It just feels hard. Are
you admitting, Liam, that you wouldn't kill baby Hitler right now on the podcast? I think we've verified the fact that it's baby Hitler.
We'll cover this on our other podcast, Baby Hitler. Yeah, it just feels a little unearned. I don't know, George, what do you think?
No, again, yeah, the ending is the weakest part, but it doesn't ruin the film for me at all.
No.
Unlike those stupid bells at the end of fucking Breaking the Waves. God damn those bells. Anyway, no, I love that film. That film is amazing.
I love the bells at the end of Breaking the Waves. Get out of here.
That film is so good.
My own ending ruins the movie is the end of Rosemary's Baby, a movie I love, but the end, I'm like, no!
Yeah,
so
the ending
good.
of that is...
Wait, what's the ending of that again?
Though then she finds out, in fact, yes, it was a devil baby, and he's been stolen by... But I think it's so much better if you're like, is she crazy?
If it ends a scene earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Be a better... Yeah. Oh, yeah. Ugh. So what did you guys talk about on the Rashomon podcast? Well, mostly Bill and Ted 3 and and Lars von Trier. Yeah. It's a tricky ending. It's a tricky movie. Like, I really... Sometimes when we talk about these movies, it's like we're obviously talking about movies that are 70 years old, but this one feels incredibly contemporary to me. It doesn't feel like it's aged a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's so influential too. You see its influence in so many different films.
Yeah, I mean, it pops up in the way that, I mean, I'm sure if you talk to someone like Quentin Tarantino about how he deals with truth, he would mention this movie. Or maybe he wouldn't, but he should.
He should.
Yeah. And like the look of it, the way like shots are designed. I was really flabbergasted to see how... Because there's just a lot at the beginning of this movie of the woodcutter walking through the woods. Like, he walks for a long time. And then we're, like, in front of him and we're behind him. But then there's a bit where the camera kind of swings around him, which is, like, pretty hard to do in the woods where you have trees. And it turns out he's the one swinging around the track, which is just, like, a very...
Amazing.
I don't know. Yeah, it's amazing. I don't even know how you...
Those sequences are
it's very...
like, just the way the
great.
Camera... like moves around it. It's kind of insane.
Very Dante-esque.
Yeah.
Halfway through my life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood.
I'm gonna just confess that my brain went to Joe Dante. It was like Gremlins.
It's like the Gremlins guy.
Wow.
I just watched that for the first time recently too.
Which one of you guys is the academic?
Gremlins 1 or Gremlins 2?
Gremlins 2, the new
one.
batch.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
There's only one Gremlins. Wait, no, there's two.
There's two.
There's two.
Yeah, I was thinking it's weird that I was thinking like, what are other movies that do the Rashomon thing that I think are really interesting? And I watched it in the past 2 years, and it's not a good movie, but the sequences that copy this are really good. And I thought of Brian De Palma's Snake Eyes.
Ooh, I have not seen that.
Oh, it's not. Well, it's great. It's vintage 90s Nicolas Cage, just like overdoing it. And the filmmaking is amazing. But it does 2 or 3 versions of the same story from multiple perspectives. And like before the movie devolves into something else, which is just like a bad Brian De Palma serial killer movie, it's a pretty... That opening Rashomon-esque sequence is really, really incredible and worth checking out.
I will always stand for Gone Girl, a movie I really like, but also a movie that has so much more going on visually than I think a lot of people realize, because they, there's just all these subtle cues throughout that we're getting the Rashomon effect. I feel like everybody knows what that movie is, but yeah, I mean, that we're getting 2 versions of a story is actually signaled super early in the movie. I don't remember the specific signals right now.
I have to watch it again. I don't remember any of that.
Yeah, Fincher does it to us, and he buries it. And there's a little bit of that in the book as well, but not in the way that the movie pulls it off. It's really very smart what he does.
I saw that at BAM. Right when it opened, I remember being like, wow, that was cool, and I haven't seen it since, but like that's a primo rewatch movie. George, do you have a favorite Rashomon-ish movie?
No, I don't. But
cool.
But Alyssa's comparison, I think, to Tarantino's films is interesting, and it's definitely applicable. To think about, let's say, for something like Pulp Fiction, which obviously isn't competing narratives of exactly the same moment, but it plays... I mean, at certain moments it does play with that. But to think about the fragmentary nature...
too.
What was that?
Hateful Eight?
Hateful Eight does it more, yeah.
I think we're contractually obligated to not talk about Quentin Tarantino for more than one moment at this podcast, or we really venture into stereotype. Alyssa, it has been great to have you on
Thank
the
you,
show.
Alyssa.
It's been great, and thanks for coaxing me into rewatching Rashomon.
We do what we can. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your podcast, which I've been listening to and really enjoying?
Sure. Yeah. It is fairly new. I think we're maybe 2 months in. So my friend Sam and I, we're both journalists. We both write about culture, and we both grew up in very conservative evangelical families, and so. We talked about how we have the same brainworms, and so we created a podcast called Young Adult Movie Ministry, which is meant to be a bit cheeky for people who went to something called that or near it when they were young. And we talk about movies and Christianity mostly in various permutations. So, like the first episode, we talked about the late great Planet Earth. We've talked about the Narnia movies. We just did a episode on Hail Caesar with A.O. Scott. We were kind of going all over the map. Movies that are plausibly related in some way. We did a really long Exorcist episode that was really great. So it comes out weekly. There's subscriber-only episodes as well, but most of them are not. And you can find us at youngadultmovieministry.com, or we're on Instagram and Twitter, and you can find us there.
And we will be sure to link to it in the notes so people can find it. I loved your Hail Caesar episode. George, you have to listen to it. It's dialectic materialism, baby. It's like it's like right in your... You haven't seen Hail Caesar?
Oh, it's so good.
Every time I say this, you're like you haven't
podcast.
Seen this.
It's on Netflix, so
yeah,
no, it's great. It's about dialectical materialism, Christianity, and Hollywood.
All right, tonight's the night.
Oh my, yeah, no, seriously,
comedy.
tonight, you have to. I watched it recently because I moved out to LA and my wife got a job at Warner Brothers, and I was like sitting in the house without a job, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna watch Hail Caesar, and then I was like, holy shit, they shot this whole movie on the Warner lot, like just the bare naked Warner lot. So I like watched it and then went over there and walked around with her, and I was like, this is Yeah, it's an amazing movie. It's a movie that could stand up to like an entire podcast devoted to it. There's so much going on in it. So definitely worth a listen. I really enjoyed it. Well, that's it for us. Next up on the show, we're going to talk about The Idiot, Kurosawa's adaptation of Dostoevsky, with A.S. Hamra, the Baffler.
Can't wait.
Critic, who actually, when we asked him to be on the show, was like, "Can I talk about The Idiot?" I was like, "Sure." No one else has asked to talk about that movie, so 100%. And if you are new to listener to the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you do it, preferably on Apple Podcasts. That's the best place to review the show. And we have a Patreon, patreon.com/oeuvrebusters. Right now, there will be an episode up on The Dirty Dozen, going back to our John Cassavetes stuff. The Dirty Dozen. So good.
So good.
Awesome.
So good. Alissa, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks again, Alyssa.
It's been great to have you. I was Liam Billingham.
Depending on who you ask, I might have been George Frigopoulos.
Oh.
I guess I was Alissa Wilkinson.
You guys were a lot more creative than me. This was Oeuvre Buster.
Nice.
Cool.